it's also very often highlighted how the European Parliament has a limited influence on trade negotiations. This was of course the case before the Lisbon Treaty, but even after that you often hear the argument that because of the Parliament's limited experience, its limited technical expertise and its lack of resources, that it's not able to be as influential as maybe was hoped. And you also very often see that the Commission is seen as a very strong agent who is able to pursue its own interest or push its own interest vis-à-vis the third party. The EU-India negotiations don't reflect this kind of view. So just to repeat what I'm doing, I'm looking at how this changing of balance of power in the international trading system, where we see the EU's negotiating power partners becoming stronger and economically more powerful as they're negotiating with Japan or Canada and of course the US, and also the institutional changes that we saw with the Lisbon Treaty, by which the European Parliament has received the veto right for any trade agreement, and also the Commission is obliged to keep the Parliament involved and informed about the negotiations. So with these changes, the paper argues that this affects the negotiating dynamics, both internally in the EU and in the negotiations between the EU and India. And it also affects the autonomy of the EU negotiators, and I'll argue that that they have been slightly restricted in their autonomy. And to carry out to put the analysis in context, I'm just using Platon's two-level game model, which of course has been used a lot when looking at the EU trade negotiations. Then the focus, the domestic focus, has most often been placed on the Council, looking at the different interests of the member states. I argue here that you need to extend the domestic focus to include the European Parliament as one of the domestic constituencies that has to ratify the agreement. So the job of the EU negotiator, which I see as being or which is of course the DG trade-based negotiating team, it has to work domestically, both with the Council and the European Parliament, to find what would be agreeable to them. They need to identify a win set, i.e. all the options that these two countries would be willing to ratify. And then this agreement will serve as terms of reference when the EU negotiator goes to negotiate with India. And of course, for an agreement to be reached, you need to have an overlap of the two win sets of India and the EU. So I'm looking at three different issues that have quite a high profile in these negotiations, and I will then see how that has affected the dynamic in the Council, in the European Parliament, and also in the international negotiations between the EU and India. And this is a very super simplified model, so don't look at it too carefully. I just want to show that when it comes to market access, the EU is very united in its preferences for increased market access to the EU market. As we have heard before, of course, India is identified as a potential or a competitor or a market with huge potential. India, of course, they are in a negotiation. India is also interested in EU market access, but the two have not yet been able to meet. Both of them have had to make concessions, but there is still a gap. There is not yet an overlap here between the two win sets. The other issue which has been high on the agenda is the inclusion of political clauses on human rights and sustainable development. And here, of course, as we know and have heard, that there are commitments on the part of the EU to include these clauses in all trade agreements. But the negotiators, supported by the member states, who were aware of India's very strong opposition to any linkage between political issues and trade issues, arguing that they deal with the political issues in other fora such as the ILO and so, and should have nothing to do with a trade agreement. Knowing this, the Commission negotiator initially suggested that the EU should take more of a flexible approach to allow, for the circumstances of India, in order to reach agreement. However, this was strongly opposed by the European Parliament, who said that it will veto any agreement that doesn't include meaningful clauses on these issues. So the Parliament is over here threatening to veto any agreement that doesn't include this. So of course this means that the wind set is only over here, and there is currently a very big gap between what the two parties want and can do. The third issue that I'll be looking at is IPR provisions in pharmaceuticals. The Commission's first proposal included very extensive provisions for IPR on pharmaceuticals, because of course they wanted to protect the EU pharmaceutical industry. This received lots of, or some opposition of course from India, which also has a strong pharmaceutical industry, which is responsible for developing and producing medicines to a large number of developing countries. So given the danger that such a provision would cause to the developing world, this mobilized a huge amount of NGOs, both within the EU and India, and their access point for their lobbying was the European Parliament. So the European Parliament then opposed the Commission's initial position and asked the Commission to revise the position. It did so and said that it promises that there would not be, or that the interest of the developing countries would be jeopardized. Parliament was not happy with this, so they pushed the Commission again, and finally they had to include in the text that there is a guarantee that India will not have to make any changes to its IPR provisions on pharmaceuticals. So here, the European Parliament, by pushing the negotiators, actually managed to get them to change their position, and there is now an overlap on this issue. So that one is solved. And so I think what it shows is also in this negotiations how close the preferences of the Council and the Commission is. So if we now look at how has this affected the actual dynamic, first domestically, starting by looking in the Council. Of course, institutional-wise, nothing has changed. The negotiators have a very close working relationship between the Member States in the Council through the Trade Policy Committee. The biggest change is the actual dynamic. Normally, as I said previously, the negotiators have had to try and find package deals and combine offensive and defensive interest in the Council, and then present that view to the third party. Here, the dynamic is much more the negotiators pushing India to get as much market access as possible, and then having to come back to the Member States in the Trade Policy Committee and say, listen, they have already offered a lot, we have to lower our expectations. And this, of course, for DG Trade itself, it means that it can't fully push its own sort of liberalist agenda. So very different kind of dynamic. In the Parliament then, which is the other domestic constituency that the negotiators now have to deal with, we can see, first of all, that there are sort of new interinstitutional arrangements being developed between the Parliament and the negotiators. The Trade Policy Committee in the European Parliament, INTA, has set up something that they call a regular monitoring group, which meets on a monthly basis, to which they invite the chief negotiating team, so they can have a sort of informal discussion with them to discuss the negotiations in confidence. There are not any notes from these meetings. The negotiators themselves have also organize regular briefings and meetings for the Parliament and the INTA members in particular. So the negotiators are really going out of their way to make sure that the European Parliament is on board, because they know, of course, if they at any point disregard the European Parliament, they might come in for a very nasty surprise at the end. And I think that the most significant development here is the fact that the European Parliament actually was able to change the position of the negotiators on political clauses. So, of course, the wind set is much reduced now, and it's difficult to find an agreement with India. On IPR, the European Parliament managed to extend the wind set. Again, they managed to change the proposal of the Commission. So a new kind of negotiating dynamic there, where it's clear that the negotiators cannot ignore the European Parliament, and they're spending a lot of time and resources on keeping the Parliament sort of calm and informed. And then finally, at the international level, we see a much more symmetrical relationship, which of course you've already alluded to here, that when the EU is negotiating with these stronger partners, there is a very different dynamic at place. We can see two on market access. The two sides are pushing their interest, but the Commission or the negotiators have still not managed to get what they want or what the EU wants, so there is still a lapse. So the negotiators are facing a much tougher negotiating partner than they sometimes might. Of course, a big change in the dynamic is the fact that the EU is so dependent or keen on the Indian market. Of course, India is keen on the EU market as well, but it's not at the level where the EU can use this conditionality for political process. It's not able to say, you need to include human rights clauses and sustainable development clauses in order for us to give access to the EU market. That doesn't work on India. We also see an alliance between India and one of the EU domestic constituencies, the European Parliament, and through that alliance, the negotiators have had to slightly change their position. So here we see a situation where the EU negotiators are facing a tough negotiator who insists on focusing solely on economic issues rather than any political issues. And we also see that the negotiators are unable to use some of the strategies that it can use in other, or that it has been able to use in the past. So that you can see that the autonomy or the ability of the negotiators to push their own interest is slightly restricted. And
well, we're out of time, sort of.
to conclude.
So,
okay,
good.
So to conclude, no, maybe I missed it. So just to conclude, it's clear that the EU negotiators are involved in a much more complex game, both domestically, where it has to take the view of the European Parliament in consideration, and also internationally, where it's facing a much stronger negotiator. The negotiators' commercial agenda is compromised. Their ability to push their own interest is compromised both internally by the European Parliament, as we saw in political process and IPR, and in international negotiations by India's strong position. So it's a work in progress. What I'm trying to do is to say that the negotiators, that their economy is restricted, and that they're working more as coordinators. They have to focus on coordinating the different interests of the Parliament, the Council, and the third party, rather than pushing their own interests.
Excellent. Thank you, Magdalena. Right, so we now open the floor up to questions. Are there any questions? Depending on the complexity and the number of questions, we can either take them in rounds or one by one, but let's try and collect a few first. Are you raising your hand there, Matthew? Yeah.